I'm not exactly sure what Pavlovian trigger caused the lull, but I'll stand up and offer an introduction right now. I don't know if you kept talking for another 15 minutes. I probably would have waited. It is my great pleasure to welcome Brian Phillips here as a part of the lecture series this year. I had the privilege of meeting Brian back when I was teaching at Temple University. We co-taught a studio, a third-year research-intensive studio, operating in a way not dissimilar from our ID4, this kind of urban-scale research-intensive studio where some fairly radical propositions came forth. Brian is now teaching at Penn, where he studied as a graduate student not so many years ago. Before that, he was in Oklahoma studying there. Brian is the founding partner within Interface Studio Architects, ISA. ISA, there it is. ISA's work has been featured in 306090, it's featured in Dwell, Architect, Architectural Record. His work has been making the rounds in architecture, and I'm convinced that those of you in the audience will learn much just from his conversation today. So I thank you for coming, Brian. I thank you for sharing your work with us. And with that, I'd like to welcome.
Awesome. Thanks. Great, thanks, Scott. Scott and I spent some time in the car today, and the whole time we're talking and catching up, I realized there were so many other things I wanted to say and other ways I wanted to say things, just having been reminded about the way he thinks and learning more about your school. I hope to be able to maybe spontaneously include some of the thinking that I've thought about today on that front. But one of the things that I wanted to be able to convey today is this kind of maybe sisterhood between Philadelphia and Detroit, and I think that I always enjoy being here and seeing a slightly different take on some of the same traumas that have sort of characterized Philadelphia, and I'm just kind of reminded and learn something about my home city when I'm here. One of the things that I think this is kind of an interesting way to sort of start that is, maybe these are both cities that have a bit of a chip on their shoulder. In a way, Philadelphia maybe even more than Detroit, because whenever I'm here, I realize that there were like spectacular things that happened at sort of some time and are about to happen again. Philadelphia, the city that threw, snowballs at Santa Claus and has done all kinds of, has wonderful reputations for very current sort of issues. This is a billboard that was on I-95 in the 70s, and I think kind of characterizes, a city that, fell from its peak of 2 million people in 1950, and today stands at about 1.5 million people. And actually, we had our first population increase in the last census, which has been sort of major, celebration for the city, and has become a real center for sort of young people and creative activity. And just to give you a sense of the context of our office, we kind of came on the scene right where there's that little uptick happening on the right-hand side of that slide. Let me try to get this in a better position. And I think that we've kind of sort of characterized our practice around being at the right place at the right time and looking carefully at our home city and we think learning from it, and now beginning to export some of those ideas to other places. So here's that zone. We opened in 2005, and so right around that sort of bottoming out is where we came onto the scene. And Philadelphia, during this is sort of a zoom in here, during this frame, a lot of things were happening. We had the housing bubble, we had this profound uptick in young people moving to the city, and of course real estate values rose, and you can see us sort of chugging along there post bubble, but you can see the shift from the turn of the century to the present. And this obviously created a lot of work for architects, and I think also created a new awareness in the city of what it can be, a sort of sense of optimism about both the present and the future. And I think this really was the springboard through which we launched our practice. When I'm not in Detroit or New York, I like to characterize Philadelphia as a combination of those two cities in a funny way, which is that in the hinterlands of the city in North Philadelphia, where a lot of the population loss occurred and a lot of the the post-industrial trauma was felt, you see images like the right, but the core of the city, sort of particularly the core that's characterized as what's known as like the third busiest downtown in America as far as pedestrian activity and density, has moments of feeling like a very big city with a lot of density. And I think it's this combination of forces that makes Philadelphia quite interesting as a lab. And the physical form of the city takes this kind of character where on the left you're seeing the very large scale CBD. Comcast Corporation is actually, their main tower is at the very top of that slide. It's kind of running off the top. They're actually building a second tower next to that, designed by Norman Foster, which is 72 stories or something. And so there's quite a bit of sort of high density recent investment. But the part of the city that interests us and really got our start is what I like to call the flat, which is this sort of 3-story row house fabric, which you're seeing on the right. Something like 450,000 row homes in Philadelphia. And the density of those blocks is kind of amazing. There's 100 unit per acre density happening in those neighborhoods where the typical lot is 16 by 50 feet, which might be 4 times the density of the typical. I think someone told me today 30 by 100 is the standard lot. So I think you can fit 4 of those lots in one Detroit lot. So quite a bit of density. But what we kind of came to, and what still characterizes a large portion of the city, is this sort of fabric where, and as sort of Detroiters, you can appreciate this, that's not all a bunch of parks, that's vacant land. And so while the fabric still kind of hangs together with the row houses, there's a lot of open territory for redevelopment. And I think right around the fringe, I mean, a lot of our early work, I can't point to this, but right around the CBD where the 3-story fabric meets the city, which is kind of the leading edge of development, an awful lot of construction has happened there. And that's also where the main industrial ring was as well, so there was a fair amount of vacant land there. So just a couple of thoughts before I jump into the work. These are just kind of 3, unlike the words I'm saying, which are a little off the cuff, these are some written, precise words about the way we think. And I think we've, out of the gate, partly because we opened our office a few years before the housing bubble, which meant that like everybody got laid off in 2008 in one afternoon. And so I think a lot of firms have had to think about how to do things other than buildings. And I think that led us to caring a good deal about buildings, but also caring about teaching and caring about curation and experiments and special initiatives. And I think for us, it's about, there are many ways to influence the built environment and the cities around us, and just making buildings is shortchanging our sort of potential for that influence. We're also really interested in systems and infrastructures and prototypes. I mean, I think we're slightly less interested in very precious singular acts of architecture and more interested in typologies and designs that we think of as sort of being repeated. And we always like to talk about things that if you moved it to a different site, which to some architects is horrifying, you could never move that to a different site. It's for this site. We like the idea of thinking about how that idea would adjust itself to that site. We also love sharing our logic with our clients and the people around us, and we're not really into the alchemy side of the mysterious sort of design process, but like to share the process and allow sort of stakeholders to become a part of it. And we actually find that it kind of radicalizes projects once sort of people buy into the reasoning. And then finally, this idea of urbanism, which I think is at the core of what we're doing. And one of the reasons why I like Detroit in particular is that you come to Detroit and you have to sort of recalibrate your definition of urban. There are a lot of areas of the city that may not look like a city, but are urban because they have history and infrastructure and the kinds of relationships. For us, this last sentence, this idea of brokering complex and contested relationships in different ways relative to different contexts, is our way of thinking about, if you're doing that, you're probably operating in an urban situation. So also, as a result of my conversation with Scott, I added slides at the end, which is probably not a great idea. And I try not to be one of those lecturers that goes on forever, so I tend to talk fast. So I'm really going to try to respect your time, but I'm also going to try to talk about a lot of stuff. So, and hopefully this is designed that at any point I can kind of break off when people start leaving. So I'll pay attention to that. But these are the 5 different lenses through which we see our work at this point, and we'll go through these in order. And infill being kind of backfilling the city, regeneration being about renovation and re-inhabiting old things, deployment about light layers of tactical things, export is our mission to push these ideas to other cities, and reflect gets a bit to this idea of non-building experiments and curation as a way to think about our work. I know it sounds like a lot. So our office is where that pink cross is there, plus sign. And many of our early projects were actually right in our own backyard. This was the opening slide, and this is one of the few early projects I still like to talk about because we're still learning from it, and I think has really defined some of the philosophical ideas about our practice. It's called 100K House, and this developer, we work for a lot of private developers, and because they build cities, and we have to figure out a way to influence them and make them do good things, work with them to do good things. This person initially was like, let's build the biggest, greenest houses we can imagine, let's make some money. We were like, okay, it was our first year of practice, maybe second year of practice. And one night he called me and said, wait. I want to build houses that all these young people moving to Philadelphia can buy. So these lots were zoned for 3-story, 2,000 square foot houses. And he came out of the gate saying, $100 a square foot, LEED Platinum, 1,000 square feet. And we said, that's a terrible idea. We're not gonna be able to do anything for that. But it taught us so much about this idea of kind of minimalism and simplicity and a kind of pragmatism about how to make a building. And so we found ourselves thinking less about how do we make a cool building that we make cheaper, and more about how do we fundamentally rethink the way we conceive of a project. And so we really obsessed about every little move. The initial projects were 4 corners, very flat. That's a picture of the developer with his family in the first house. Extremely Spartan IKEA kitchens, exposed concrete radiant floor. You can see the plywood finishes. I think this house was built for $105,000, which in our terms is very inexpensive. When I came to Detroit the first time, people were like, that's too expensive to build here. Although we do think there's some version of this that would play very well here. So we called these urban cabins. This original house had 2 doors, the front door and the bathroom door. We were talking a little bit today about the challenges of mortgages and appraisals, and one of the funny things about these houses is we've done some subsequently where we actually had to put walls in for closing to show closed bedrooms, and then they would get ripped out, which is a whole other conversation, but I think it's an interesting subtext to innovation and the different layers of other things that affect buildings. So part of our challenge was like, what do you do on flat, simple walls? And so I think all the facades you're seeing here are fiber cement. Here we silk screened on these with sort of t-shirt type silk screen technology. We love the idea of house tattoos, which we also think would play well in Detroit, just kind of throwing these ideas out. We haven't quite moved, this was an experiment that we really want to get back to because we like this idea of housing as consumer products that are fun and are more like shopping for other things than houses, which tend to be a constraining transaction. I think this was a $5,000 add to the project. We used one screen, we flipped them around, extremely sort of simple in deployment. The original houses were built out of SIPS panels, which are highly insulated. You can see the insulation sandwich there between OSB. One of the interesting dynamics that's worth sharing with you is that a lot of our work is not built by custom contractors. One of the ways you build a house for $100 a square foot is not your cleverness, it's the fact that the contractor is willing to even entertain the idea that his profit is at a different level. So these guys, the SIPS panels came out, and these guys were very confused by what they were doing. And so that's a real hurdle. And one of the funny things about this project, so these 2-story SIPs, if you just think this through, relies very heavily on the plumbness of the top of the foundation. So if there's a little bit of, and at this level of contractor, there's always a little bit of that. Those panels, when they got stacked, would reveal some 2-inch sort of separations at the top, and these are passive house level insulation, so that was an interesting sort of struggle to resolve, which was like resolved in the field, but it's just this issue of like cost and contractor and technology aligning is always a challenge. We actually wound up doing, and we continue to do this, we like the idea of using double stud walls because they're really easy to deal with. You can bid them to any contractor in town. Everybody knows how to build it. And the pricing actually has been has been quite good. And there was also a philosophy with this builder. Prefab is a whole other conversation, but this builder was this developer was very interested in building local economies and jobs, and so he loved the idea of having guys from Philadelphia out here building the houses and not having them built off-site. So this really has kind of come together in a nice way. All of these buyers elected to roll $15,000 into their mortgages to put solar panels on the roof, and I think this goes back to this idea of what kinds of houses are young people buying and what are their values and what are they willing to spend money on that maybe their parents weren't. And so this was an interesting experiment in that. I did mention prefab, and this is another kind of formative sort of project for us, which was a recession project conceived of just on the back end of the bubble, and was a prefab project. You can kind of see this is another sort of infill site, a lot larger. I think this footprint was upwards of 20,000 square feet. This was a 4-story, 72-unit student apartment building near Temple. And was conceived out of the gate as being prefab modular. This developer was really interested in experimenting with that. You can see the straightforwardness of the plan, and part of our understanding about sort of prefab technology, which we embraced, is that you want to work, as much as they tell you they can do anything, you want to work to their system, because the moment they start not doing what they're used to doing, it gets expensive, they don't understand fire separations, there's a whole series of things that happen. So we really embrace the idea that these boxes are going to be simple. There's a shot of the alley side of the building. The building was clad in the field. I have some images here of the construction. I'll just say something about, sorry, this is a little random, but I just want to say something about Philadelphia green roofs. Philadelphia has a really aggressive stormwater law that requires the first inch of rain to be managed on site. So what's happened is we get what we like to call ugly green roofs, which we kind of love, which are these, they're not there to be, you know, an amenity as much as they're just there to really be a sponge. And so this actually was the largest sedum green roof in Philly when the project was finished. Here's how the building was built. There's if you go to our website, there's a video where you can see. This is being recorded, right? You can see the OSHA laws being violated by the guys under these boxes that are hanging up there. And part of it's just this is a very this technology at this scale at this time in Philly was a sort of brand new idea. And one of the interesting things was, you know, it happened very, very fast. The whole building was built in 9 months. And what was really interesting is, you'll kind of see that here. The site work was being done on top while the boxes were being built in a factory in the middle row. And then they all came together on the bottom there. And those 72 units, I think, everything was a modular box. The stairs, the lounges, I think it was 90 boxes, and they would set about 8 or 10 a day. So if you do the math, the building appeared out of nothing in about 2 weeks, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. But then what's interesting is all the seams, so the boxes come out with finishes and kitchens and bathrooms in them, and then everywhere the boxes come together, you have to go in and finish. So it's a very different idea about building. There's a lot of room for innovation there because we're used to building buildings in layers where all the plumbing, all the drywall, all the tile goes in. This was more these sort of chunks that are complete with these seams that kind of need to be infilled. So this is a more recent project, which I thought would be kind of fun to share. This is a very quirky, weird site. It's 15 feet wide and 100 feet long, and that's an elevated train line. And we find ourselves loving these kinds of sites. And our idea for this was, this is in a zoning class that had some funny requirements. It allowed you to go up to 55 feet, had this funny requirement for a cornice line at 25 feet. And so we became very interested in these bands of buildings that kind of accumulated over time. You can kind of see us sort of drawing these little profile lines there at the bottom. And so really we saw the profile of the building as an expression of the kind of constraints of the site. And so we kind of used that line to sort of develop the membrane. And what was interesting is those sloped pieces were able to create some terraces. And one of the things we had to convince our client of, who was really, of course he bought a cheap piece of land next to a train line, and his whole thing was like, how do we make it feel like you're not living next to a train? And we were like, well, we're kind of thinking maybe you should just go with it. So we have these terraces that are actually like right on the train. And while you hear the train go by, it's kind of an exhilarating experience. So you can kind of see the left side is the back of the building and the right side is the front. That really, you can see that cornice basically, I mean, I want to say it's 8 or 10 feet from the edge of the L line. And so it's almost done. This is it under construction. But you know, this is our world of getting these buildings done is that pickup truck. Like, these guys are building these buildings, and one of the things we take some pride in is finding ways of taking very everyday projects where, you know, this guy came to us with, I have to measure my words in case he watches this. He really came to us thinking, you know, this is, you know, I'm here to make some money, and I have this train line, and he ended up doing this really fun, interesting building that he eventually took real ownership out of, and has really been an advocate for making sure that everything gets done the way we asked for. And I think that we take great pride in turning, it goes back to this getting developers to collaborate on building the city well, and I think it's a very exciting pursuit for us. So I think this project kind of comes out of the 100K house DNA. We're starting to look at whole blocks now, and I actually think it's really funny just to talk a little bit about style. I mean, when we first proposed the cyan paint to our client, he was like, that's gonna stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, how are you possibly gonna paint that building? And the reason I love this photo is sometimes you look at it and don't quite see the building, because South Philadelphia is so bananas with its circus of porches and funny materials. And so one of the things we enjoy is really contributing to the sort of fabric of the city and kind of amplifying or over-amplifying the context to a point that it feels radical, but actually is just very much in keeping with what's going on. This is a collection of buildings that are 2-story row houses, 3-story row houses. The bottom right corner there is a commercial first floor with 2 flats above. You know, and you can see we're actually using drivable grass in the middle where cars can park, but if everybody decides not to park there, they can have a party, kids can go out and play. So there's some flexibility in how that space gets used. Kind of get a sense there of the kind of massing and scale. And there you can kind of see the different sort of building types that are happening, the sort of row house models on the top and bottom of those plans, and then the condo flats there in the middle. This is a little further along on this at this point, but again, you get a sense of it's metal, that's hardy plank, that's field painted. A lot of modesty in the material palette. Just I think a nice willingness on the part of our clients to let us do our thing. And so roof yards and access is a big deal in Philly, particularly if you're providing off-street parking, that the sites are small. So these roof experiences become you know, significant. And what's interesting is, you know, here you can see, so this was a project subject to the stormwater law, and so green roofs become a way to meet it. And so what's interesting is, you know, again, these are going to get a little prettier through time, but they can be hard to walk on. If you walk on a green roof, that green roof suddenly has to get a lot thicker and a lot more robust. So this is basically trench grade on some sleepers, and so that's a way for us to get some walkable space up there for you know, very little investment, still keeping the you know, stormwater management roof as opposed to the expensive roof. So these are just some of the things that we play with to achieve some of these goals. So I'm kind of working up in scale. This is currently going through approvals and is a much bigger project, which is pretty close to the center. It's one of the bigger pieces of ground left this close to the city. Large-scale developer, dedicated to this being prefab modular, which is kind of interesting. And I think the thing worth talking about here is this interesting courtyard condition that we're sort of presented with. And the client, frankly, came to us with the idea that they thought this should be a courtyard. And of course, we went back to them and said, well, let us study it. And we spent some time, and we came back and we said, yes, we think it should be a courtyard too, after we couldn't get some other things to make sense. But what was interesting about this courtyard is, and if you look at the different street sections there, the different sides of the courtyard have very different streets and different kinds of you know, building typologies across the street. And so we had this idea that the courtyard was kind of responsive, and even though it's sort of large, I think this is 70 units of where it sort of stands now. We kind of like the idea of the courtyard presenting a different sort of personality to these different frontages, and I think the big victory here for us was, the starting point, of course, was the left, which is the courtyard needs to be cordoned off, and it's going to be parking, and it's going to be private, and there's a park across the street, and I think in our mind this project is big enough that, Philadelphia is a city of very delicate urban components with lots of sort of pedestrian amenities and very walkable, and so we were able to convince them that not only should this become 3 different buildings with gaps, but we should actually start to perforate the first floor so that people can use this as a sort of cut through. And so what we began to think about was the idea that we would remove these boxes as sort of a modular system, and all the buildings are obeying the 16-foot wide grid, and so we can kind of push and pull pieces and go from single family to multifamily pretty easily. But the idea would be that you can get some higher pieces on, so we're going to omit some boxes, but ultimately we're going to get the same number of total boxes because we're going to put them on top. We didn't quite do that, but we're somewhere in between. But they really embrace this idea of the pass-through, and so the kind of social life of the project, on the left, you're seeing a way through from the street. On the right, you're seeing one of these corridors that's created within the courtyard that leads you out. And then on the right, you're seeing this idea of the roof deck, which is created when we put boxes on top and create these gaps. So the idea that there's a lot of private space in the project, but there's a lot of shared space, and also just this sort of idea of block making. So this is the sort of courtyard that we're conceiving of. And one of the really interesting things about it too is this whole process of, there's certain amenities in Philadelphia that, yards, small yards are something that people hold dear. And one of the things we had an interesting conversation about with our client is the fact that the site's not going to support yards the way some sites will. So rather than forcing that on a site that doesn't need it, let's conceive of a more social backyard space where it's really more of a terrace. And when people are barbecuing, they can decide to eat together. They're going to see their kids. It's almost like a promenade where you're going to see your neighbors in kind of a classic way. And they really sort of embrace that, this idea that you kind of make the most of the site presented, and we're excited about that potential. And so here you can kind of see this sort of geometry of the modular, which is 16-foot divisions, which become both single families and multifamilies. And then at these what we call knuckles, you see one at the bottom, you see a couple near the bottom, you see one at the top. Those are actually larger single family homes, some of which could be $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. But what's interesting is in this project of 66 units, you're going to have 3 large expensive houses. You're going to have 40 or 30 more modest houses. And then you're going to have a bunch of 600 square foot flats, which might be $199,000, right? Which in Philadelphia is kind of untouchable. So the idea here is actually to make a community showing the total bandwidth of the current market. And we're excited about that. It's kind of an unusual thing to find in a single project. And so binding that with this courtyard idea was quite important. So here's one of the corners of the project. You can kind of see some of those 4th floor boxes now that have been placed on top. A whole host of different opportunities for sort of outdoor space and balconies. This is a corner, so the park is across the street, and I don't know if you can quite appreciate the narrowness of the street to the right, but that cartway might be 9 feet wide. So they're really, and you can kind of see how that frontage doesn't have as many projections, and the first floor is set back. So we had a lot of debate about how continuous the courtyard should be and how much diversity, and this is kind of where we've landed with this sort of wall building that wraps the whole block. And then, just looking at how the 16-foot sort of dimension works, at the top is, there's a lot of, Philadelphia row homes that kind of operate that way, and you can kind of see the kitchen there in the back, which we anticipate being on that rear terrace area, and then access to the roof up at the top. The multifamily buildings use the same, so we kind of fit these buildings into the same sort of dimensional component, the 16 feet, where we're getting apartment flats that kind of fit into the space of those single family homes. And what's interesting is the client, as they refine their pro forma, can kind of mix and match the number of apartments versus the number of single families. this just goes back to context, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but we are getting access to some slightly more, slightly bigger budgets, maybe? Maybe that's what's kind of different here, but this is a different part of the city. This is more in town. This is kind of, the South Street is perennially kind of a hipster area, but a like 80s punk rock kind of hipster area, not the kind that are making coffee out in kind of neighborhoods, a more classic version. And so it was kind of interesting that this block, we were doing an apartment building on South Street and then some large homes on the back. This is the building as kind of conceived, which is, I'm hoping the proportion of that is right. Just realizing it might not be. Looks a little compressed from here. But this kind of language of sort of metal cladding and the kind of transparency of the balconies, it's kind of interesting. It's got a bit of a Bourbon Street feel where like it's cool to come out, but you want to be a little bit protected because you're not quite sure what might be going on there. And this is something this is a little bit like the last project that I kind of showed, is we've been really intrigued by projects that get big enough where you're addressing, I mean, in Philadelphia, you might be addressing different neighborhoods on different sides of a block. So on South Street, you've got the terraces and the kind of nightlife promenade, and then literally on the backside of the block, you have a 15-foot wide neighborhood street. And so thinking about how blocks can get completed in that way. There's some sort of particularly nice units on top that have these access ways to the roof where you're actually outside. This is kind of the ground level experience at retail. This is a retail corridor. And then the roof experience is up that exterior stair, looks like this. And it's interesting that this building, the top two units are actually quite expensive and maybe have people living in it that you wouldn't expect. And then there's other kinds of people living in the building. And I think that's also related to that last project of these projects that seem to have some diversity in that. And I just popped these in because it's getting close to being done. I apologize for the quality of the photography, but it gives you a sense of what the build is looking like. So that's almost done. Totally other scale. And the thing I want to talk about here, I think is very programmatic, is this idea that this was a project that we looked at from the micro-housing standpoint, and that's a term I'm sure you guys have heard, which is really, I think, coming out of markets like New York and Boston and San Francisco, where things are so expensive that scale becomes a way to get access to certain areas of the city. Philadelphia is not that town. You can generally go around the corner and find something that's affordable. So what was interesting about this project for us was thinking about micro-housing as a Philadelphia-specific idea. And for us, it actually became much more about a lifestyle and this idea of shared and flexible. We were very interested in this post-college, pre-family period of life, which I would characterize in places like Philadelphia as this incredible number of people between 25 and 35 that are working, that are being entrepreneurial, that are opening companies, that are looking for a different kind of housing situation. And we think that's quite an interesting possibility for buildings like this. And so just a couple things to sort of point out as I talk. I mean, we love these kinds of catalogs of things, and we call this the periodic table of micro units. The x-axis is width and the y-axis is length, and then we would just, this goes back to client transparency. Like this is a meeting we have with our client where we just basically say, as you begin to enlarge and tweak the scale of these units, these are the different things that happen, and to talk through what's possible. And that dotted line area is the sweet spot of the size of unit they thought they wanted. So then we go from that to being able to kind of say, okay, let's look at how that works. And what's interesting about this site is we had far more allowable height than we had FAR, which means that we had additional vertical sort of possibility, which led to this idea of the mezzanine, which is less than 1/3 of the total area of the unit isn't a floor. So that led to this sort of verticality in the units, and we experimented a little bit with how those might work. And then we were really interested in the defining characteristic of this building really was this idea of shared spaces, and this idea that like the laundry bar, the co-working space, the commercial kitchen, which is where you'd host your dinner party instead of your unit. This idea that the lifestyle of the building is you're paying for a bed and a small private space, but there are all these shared components of the building that allow people to to achieve this sort of lifestyle that you see playing out in the urban fabric of a lot of big cities at the moment. And a little nod to the Philadelphia neighborhood fabric, which is this idea of the hallway stoop, where you get this little hallway side niche to kind of hang out, and these hallways become a little bit more like streets. And then that's the context of that project. With one of the thoughts too is, retail on the first floor, and then the second floor is this kind of maker space, co-working space that really is also a kind of condenser for both the neighborhood and the city, but also the people living there. I wanted to share this because this is on the boards now, and we're super excited about it, and really represents the kinds of challenge. This goes back to the project next to the rail line, I think, and projects on design. But I just want to point out the site. The site is and I don't have my laser pointer here, but if you see that SUV turning to the right, there's a car parked on our site. It's 12 feet wide, and it's literally like right on the edge of Chinatown. And what was amazing is we got a by right zoning permit for this. I mean, we were all laughing that this could possibly happen, that we could meet the zoning code explicitly, but we did. So we're super excited about it. And really the thought here was, how do you maximize the scale of a 12-foot wide site? This is a section investigation, and so the idea was, well, we should use the basement, we should create bi-levels, we should do the mezzanine trick that we were talking about before to get more verticality without adding a floor. And then there was this idea of, in Philadelphia, you're able to project off a facade 3 feet. So we're putting all these things together and kind of develop this little wafer building. Units actually aren't that crazy. We'll look at them. So this kind of gives you a sense of the scale. It's actually like a skyscraper. It has the proportion of a very tall building, even though it's not that tall. We don't think this will all be wood frame, sadly. But here you get a sense of what this just kind of goes through the section of the building, and you can kind of see ways that we're looking to kind of grab extra space and maybe occupy the site in some unexpected ways, one of which is to make the basement feel like a reasonable place to live, and I think we're getting there. And so, so here you kind of get a sense of what the units are like. There's a single stair in the center of the building, the basement level's at the bottom, which actually has turned out to be a pretty reasonable one. But the typical units upstairs are that kind of first floor kitchen, live, office with a bathroom, and then a sort of mezzanine that you sleep on. I think these are in the well, you can see here, 344 square feet. And it's a fun site. I mean, we haven't really designed it, but this is kind of this is the proportion of the building. And we're also pretty excited about the fact that from the Funkin Highway, it's going to really be quite a prominent sort of experience. So, this falls into the category of kind of weird leftover sites that we really enjoy working on. And I think, our move about this, and it goes back to that other project, is if you're able to kind of, if you can prove maximum value, you can generally get this conversation to go forward and to get good real estate developers to embrace the idea. That was the longest category, by the way. So that was, you guys are like, oh my God, I remember that was by far the longest category. What's my cut time? I have my clock and I can do whatever time. What's that? All right. So again, I just want to start with a sort of formative project, and then we'll look at some more recent stuff. So the Granary, which was a firestorm for us for a number of reasons, but we also learned so much from this project, and this is very interesting. It was actually the first example of slip-form concrete in the US, which is why it's on the historic register, and was really smack dab in the middle of Philadelphia industry. And actually, the site where it says Industrial Works, there on the left is where the Barnes Foundation is that was recently built for that collection. So now this area of the city is completely transformed, but this building remains. And it was built in the 1860s out of wood. If you didn't know, grain is highly explosive. It blew up. Was rebuilt in the 1920s as this concrete building. And then when the grain transfer point and infrastructure changed, the building went basically into sort of disuse. And in the 80s, there was a kind of eccentric designer who had his office on the bottom and a legendary party penthouse on top, which is often the kind of uses that these buildings fall sort of victim to. And So we were very interested in how do you put this building back to work, and the idea was to build housing on top, as you see on the sort of future side, and we measured the amount of housing we could put on top by thinking about what the grain probably weighed and said, okay, so that's the foundation for the building. And the cool thing is that in urban areas, sometimes people like to get up high and have views, and so our foundation was starting at floor 9, so the first floor of construction had great views. And then what was interesting is these grain silos, that there were 72 of these crazy vertical storage compartments, and the idea really was to reuse those as galleries and for environmental sort of purposes. I mean, we figured we could store stormwater coming off that building in one of those for like the entire year. They were so vast. We talked to our MEP engineer about the middle cells could almost be like earth ducts because the temperature was so insulated from the outside, and there'd be some great thermal transfer. And then the idea of galleries and sort of other things, and the climbing wall there and for the residents. But this really for us was a really important project in thinking about history and understanding. And I think this is very relevant to Detroit in the sense that Philadelphia is a city with like an embarrassment of old buildings that just don't have a life. Like there's no market to regenerate them. And I think this idea of taking more aggressive, clever approaches to them is important. Like here, so when this project ultimately died on the back of, quote, this building is as important as City Hall, which we were baffled by from a historic perspective, but our whole position was the building was built to do work and it should continue to do work. But I think what really set them off was this idea that the penthouses in that glass box were kind of living among the ornamental detail on the top of the building, which you could no longer see from the outside. But I think, again, for us, the thinking was, how do you really, not in a sort of boutique way or relying on some museum to move in and take care of the building in a non-economic way, sort of make this work. So climbing wall and mushroom farming was really the final proposal. Didn't go forward, but I'll say later in the reflect section, which isn't as far away as you think, talk about how that spun off a research project and seeing that relationship between sort of speculation and architecture and that. So this is a reuse we're doing right now, and it's kind of interesting. There's a 6-story existing warehouse in the middle, and then we're building houses around it. I think, I'm realizing again, this falls into the category of a whole block that transforms itself as it hits different sort of frontages. And so one of the things that, that's the building with the water tower is the one that we're renovating, and then the houses flanking it are the ones that we're proposing. And one of the things that we did was we really enjoyed this idea of the warehouse street wall, and so that's actually 25 townhouses. This is kind of the narrow street that has a certain typology, and the wider street has a bigger one. Tons of under construction photos just because I wanted to be able to share that with you, but this is about where it is. It's a little further along than this. But that's the narrower street that has these terraces that come out, and you can kind of see that the front doors are pushed back. This is the busiest street. The facade flattens out. The first floor is buffered from the street with some program. So this idea of this kind of block transforming, this is the existing building that we're working on. And really that existing building has really awesome bones, and we're just kind of whitewashing the interior and putting some kitchens and bathrooms in. And so that combination of existing building and new construction completing the block, I think, is the story here. And very interested in, it's funny because we were having this conversation about do you return Detroit to its existing fabric? And I think at some level it's like, hell no, it's going to require a lot of people and but in this particular situation, which is a highly gentrifying part of the city, returning the fabric, that back alley is a horror show right now. And our argument to the neighborhood was like, we want to front houses on that alley. It was obvious that people wanted to put parking back there, and we really stood by the idea that we should just complete that alley because that is part of what makes the neighborhood awesome. So it's an exciting project for us as far as kind of urban fabric. This may be my most relevant Detroit project. This is a historically registered building in Philadelphia. This was like the first parking. In Philadelphia, it's like every building is the first something, and it's a bit frustrating sometimes. This was like the first parking garage associated with a railroad company or something, and and there's the railroad company. But literally, we found this building without a roof. I mean, that Instagram is our first sort of site visit. And so the proposal is just to build a neighborhood inside this building and leave the roof off. The National Park Service battle on this was absolutely, because they're trying to get tax credits, of course, and the idea of like, we had to retain the roof line and all kinds of things. So the building actually doesn't sort of come above the outer wall, but this is getting built in a related form. But this is kind of the idea that you're basically taking that shell of a building and you're using it as a platform for something new. And I think this is very much like the Granary project, where here's a bit of history, and our solution to it is based on current economics and not aspirations to return to something that doesn't exist anymore. And I think on that basis, we're extremely excited about this model, or this sort of system or prototype. This is more of a campus kind of thing that we're working on, which is an old chemical campus, an old BASF research campus outside of Philadelphia. And the idea here is simply to like return, this is a kind of incremental project where it's not about restoring every building to its former glory, but it's lightly enhancing some kind of components of it. And so you can kind of see here with color and annotation and landscape in a very subtle way, this creating of an urban space where there might not be an urban space. And this little alley is super important to us, and having that moment of creating vibrant creative workspace. There's a brewery that we're working with on the left there that is going to be that kind of tenant. But it was kind of interesting because this is what it looks like now, and I think there was this, it was difficult for people to understand how this could be urbanized, and I think actually it's been an interesting sort of experience to think about. And really on this kind of building, which doesn't need a whole lot of work. The idea here is not to spend tons of money renovating the whole building, but to kind of let the existing building sit and just begin to modify some of the components to be able to develop a kind of language around all these buildings. So the lobby gets impacted, but the back office of these buildings kind of remains. This is a related project for Rodale Press. It's the largest woman-owned publishing company in the United States, I think. A little bit north of where we are. And it's kind of interesting, they're based in New York and here, and it's very expensive to do photo shoots and to do some of the work they do in New York City, so they wanted to create a kind of creative hub in this existing warehouse, which is pretty unremarkable at the moment. But the idea is to kind of, they're very interested in food and sort of test kitchen stuff. And so the proposal really is to kind of remove, you can see there's a funny, you might be able to equate these images now. We're removing the funny entry chunk to create a courtyard, which opens up a new social space. And so there's photography and a little overnight accommodation and a test kitchen that is going to create this sort of incubator for, Maria Rodale talks about Emmaus becoming Portland, and I think we're not holding our breath on that, but the idea that they see this relatively modest renovation project as something that can become a seed for the transformation of a neighborhood, we find really interesting. And then, so that's looking back out from the test kitchen to the plaza. See, that was pretty quick, right? So I think now, the deploy work is this lighter layer, which we've become pretty interested in, and this is a public seating sort of project we did, and just goes to like local, the budget for this was $20,000, like done. We had to bring the benches out. They were expecting to get one, we gave them 3. They were really happy about that. But the idea here was simply that, if you develop a new kind of public seating, like you want it to look like a seat, like it can't be so different that people won't sit on it. But the idea was to be able to create a kind of social comfort among people, and so that's this delicate balance between being able to feel like you have your own space, but also being sort of proximate enough to other people in a comfortable way to want to engage. Was built with local craftsmen and fabricators, and devised in a way that it can come apart easily and get moved. It all sort of fits together in sort of 3 pieces, which are geared toward the weight that the maximum weight a union guy can carry with a friend. All these rules. We managed to solve that. Here it is going together. This is the main train station in Philadelphia. And I think, it really, it was kind of here, and it was used in a certain way, and then this was it in a neighborhood park out in Philly, and this was not staged. This was just us showing up and people wondering why we were taking their picture. But you know, really heavily used, and actually, you know, I don't really capture all the crazy things that happened, but we had an Instagram feed, and we saw things on these benches that, you know, were unspeakable. But was really interesting. It was interesting just as a kind of social infrastructure for the city, and I think I think it may have worn out by now. I think it was in year 3, and you know, when the large dogs were running over top of it, and Tai Chi was happening in strange places on it. But I think we really got excited about the kinds of impacts you can have in small ways. And then this is maybe a more formalized, I think, similar idea, and we love these assignments where someone has a crazy notion and we test it. Philadelphia is full of tactical urbanism and full of beer gardens, and it seems like when the weather is good, you can sell beer anywhere. And so this guy was like, I want to take existing surface parking lots and build a platform and put beer gardens on them, because a lot of these surface parking lots in town are in these amazing canyons with buildings around them, and his idea was we can really monetize this space. So really the proposal was this kind of system where the platform's actually off-the-shelf technology from this company in Cleveland, I think. The bar and the restrooms are in, you know, containers, and it's sort of a strategy for being able to deploy this on a seasonal basis. And really, again, gets to this idea of sort of prototypes and thinking about sort of systems of occupation. And what was kind of fun was, you know, speculating a little bit about this added value idea that, you know, there's a beer garden on top of parking, and is there a benefit both ways? And so we're thinking, well, during the summer you get shaded parking, you can charge a little bit more for the parking. There might be the risk that you get some beer spilled on your car. We'll see how that might go. But and this was our exploration of like the beer drinking experience on top and the car parking experience on the bottom. But I think we have a number of really interesting assignments coming up. This renovation of an existing pier on the river that's being conceived of as this kind of crazy maker space market and beer garden. And another project we're looking at is doing a large-scale tactical installation that precedes a large private development, which is really fascinating, that it's like $1 billion 10-year build, and they're like, look, the first season we want to get people on the site and make a space, a public space for the community, and maybe that lives on as the project gets built around it. And one of the things we're thinking about there is actually playing around with the ongoing construction as a kind of sort of visual for the community space. We talk a lot about this sort of permanent temporary work, which I think has a lot of application here as well. And so some of this work, and I am going to show a Detroit idea here. We're going to get to that. Some other cities we're working in. My new partner's in Boston. We have some projects going on up there. Client from Chicago flew to Philly and said, I like these 100K houses. Let's do some houses in Chicago. And so we've been doing some work out there. This is a 31-unit project that's based on there's not that many attached houses in Chicago, actually. This was like a half a block project, a little bit like some version of what we did in Philly. And you know, I think the comment here, I mean, beyond it having a lot of 100K characteristics and being energy efficient, even though it didn't seem to be a priority for him, but we said, Bob, just do a blower door test. Let's just pay the $100 for the blower door test, and the infiltration rate on these houses is lower than some of our LEED Gold houses in Philly, and it's just partly because Chicago contractors are a wee bit better, I think. Because it's all, you know, in the end, it's all about the tightness of the envelope, and so that was kind of interesting. But really, this project was just about like, how do you know, this thing's getting built for $115 a square foot, right? That's hardy plank. We worked with the contractor to make sure we could get that detail to work. We looked at some photos, and he did it. And so you can kind of see some similarities here with the open plan from some of the Philly projects, but definitely has a kind of Chicago, you know, sensibility about it. Stairs are often places in these buildings where we're able to add a little bit of value. This is our riff on the Chicago 3 flat, and I think what was interesting about this is this kind of goes back to the Chinatown thing a little bit with finding the basement level. I thought I had a diagram there somewhere, but basically the courtyard, that courtyard is excavated, so there's windows in the basement level where you walk out from the basement. And you can kind of see the units are sort of designed with a living side and a bedroom side. Oh, there you go. So there's roof deck, there's terraces, and there's this sort of sunken courtyard, and you can kind of see the missing sort of triangle site there. And there you can get a sense of what that experience is like down in that courtyard, which actually makes that basement unit really, really terrific. Interiors. A lot of the same sort of aspirations from our work that we're doing in Philadelphia. So in Boston, this was a competition to do housing that produces more energy than it uses, and this was a mayor's initiative. And one of the things that we learned in Philadelphia with energy efficient housing is that it's all about envelope, that you can, by insulating a house well and air sealing a house well, you can take 80% of the energy out of the house. What's funny about this challenge, and we've become very skeptical of net zero because we feel like if everything was 80% better, we'll have done so much more than having a few net zero projects. But because you get into conversations about to go to net zero or net energy positive, you're gonna need solar panels. And we literally had a conversation once with a client about, do you cut down the trees on the site to make sure that you get the solar exposure to meet the challenge of whatever and so you get into these wild conversations. Anyway, what was interesting about the project is we kind of took this envelope idea that this is a double stud wall project with lots of insulation. I think we were approaching like R65 in these roof assemblies. And basically it was like, how much PV do we need to get over the hump? And I think I have so you can kind of see the sort of nature of the site here, and you can see the solar panels on the roof, which are pretty extensive. But at one point we actually thought we'd be wrapping the whole back of the house with PV, and we're kind of happy that we were able to keep it on the roof, and you can see that that actually revealed the opportunity for terraces in the back, which I think you can see here. You can kind of get a sense that the sort of geometry of the roof was, calibrated to the sort of solar angle. There's a sort of stack effect ventilation strategy. And this is apparently in a pretty challenging neighborhood in Boston. We could never really see it. But this was seen as, there's a massive affordable housing shortage in Boston, and so they're very interested in figuring out how to provide new housing types that both sort of save energy, but also hit a certain kind of price point. These are price points beyond what Philadelphians and Detroiters know is affordable, but it's a different market. But you can see a lot of the same sort of strategies deployed here that we're deploying other places. And as much as we want to believe that design is such a big part of high performance buildings, this is where it happens. And in a way, like making sure that these guys, you can see the double stud wall, this had blown in insulation. What this guy is doing here in the middle picture is incredibly important, which is to just button up all of the sort of potential areas for there to be an air exchange. And these houses ended up, I think I have an image of it here. It's kind of cool, actually. Northeastern University is actually tracking the performance of these houses, and the green line, if you follow the green line, that shows you where there's net positive energy being produced, and all four of these houses have been doing quite well. Of course, the infill houses are doing better because they have less exterior wall. And this is our current project in Boston that's going through review. And I just want to talk about context again, because it's something that we're really interested in, and thinking about how to generate opportunities out of the fabric. And so really our argument here was this neighborhood has big warehouses and that look like warehouses and commercial buildings, and little houses that have pitched roofs. And so our strategy was to create this hybrid. And what was kind of interesting about that, and it goes back to this sort of mezzanine level, the top of the building, where we start playing with this roof shape, generates these double height spaces and these sleeping lofts and incredible views. And so again, I think it's super interested in how context generates possibilities for something new that's still very much in keeping with what was there. And there's nothing more fulfilling than like a neighborhood meeting where people actually pick up on what you're doing and feel like, I understand, like I respect the fact that you're trying to pull that out of our city. And I think that just goes back to this idea of kind of sharing logics with stakeholders. You can here get a sense of the retail base and the common roof deck, which actually happens behind that kind of crenellated roof form, which you can kind of see there. DIY house. So we did have a moment where we were pitching a version of 100K to Detroit, and I'll just share with you what our thought was, because I remember coming to Detroit and meeting with Midtown, and this whole idea that like a $100,000 house would be just preposterous, like it would have to be a $10,000 house, and we're kind of scratching our head like, okay. But what was interesting about it is it really got us to think a little bit about how one might adjust that thinking. And our idea was, so at first we were like, well, you build a small house and you can add to it. But then the idea became, well, if we want to go high performance envelope, the climate here is such that that makes sense, it gets cold. To really explore where the certificate of occupancy happens and to try to ratchet back the investment in the house as far as you can. The building code, I don't think would quite, I mean, we're being a little bit speculative with this, but the idea being that you kind of capitalize on the emerging maker culture of young people in Detroit and saying like, well, you don't want people messing with the envelope, but you can certainly have people building out the insides of their house through time incrementally and living in them in different ways. So that was really the theory of the project, was this idea that you build out the envelope, but you let the inside of it happen through time. So interior partitions, painting, lighting, storage, flooring potentially, to allow that to become a kind of ongoing activity. Everybody's house has, I mean, people work on their houses and constantly after they sort of purchase them. So the idea was like, can we ratchet that back? And that was our version of what that might be. And we also thought a lot about the incremental urbanism of that kind of idea about the fact that, and there was this whole discussion, this was 4 or 5 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, and there's this whole discussion about why would you build new things when there's no market for it. And I think the idea became, well, maybe it's this combination of like aspirational and sort of retrofit, and that there is a place, new things say something about the vitality of a market. And frankly, I think you're starting to see it. I mean, it's happening now, which is exciting, and I think that's important. So I did add this because Scott and I had this conversation today about evidence-based design, which is this whole other topic. But I did want to mention this because I think it's interesting in that we've done a number of projects where we collaborated with a health scientist on outcomes-based design related to health. And this was a project for supportive housing. It's a competition in Syracuse. And basically, I'm going to have to talk through this very quickly, but the idea was she creates this kind of brief, does a literature search. It's a way of starting a project. Like for this population, there is known credible literature supporting these conditions and these tendencies, and exposure to light, the way people socialize. And so the project that we developed was coming out of this. And I don't want to present this as a kind of one-to-one relationship, but I want to present it as maybe a sort of method or a way of thinking. And what was interesting is at the larger scale of thinking about how this filters in, I mean, one of the conclusions we had about this project was that there were different kinds of social spaces. There were social spaces where there were reactions to social conditions where people are ensured that they won't encounter people unlike them versus conditions where they might be exposed to the public. And so that actually hatched this idea of the 2 courtyards, where the inner courtyard was for sort of residents only, and then the outer courtyard was this interface with the street. And so that's what sort of generated this knot of a kind of known courtyard and then the beginning of an interaction with the public, and also the beginning of a building that starts to make a street wall, which this city doesn't really have at the moment. So, and there were all kinds of other things going on here about landscape, and there were sort of greenhouses built into the project based on the beginning of skill building and research related to exposure to vegetation. And so you can kind of see one of those greenhouses there. The corridors designed in a way that created a whole variety of different increments of sort of socialization. So we have a series of projects. It's a whole other talk, but I just wanted to mention it because I know that this is something that is on the minds of some of the faculty and the students here. We're very intrigued by this idea of evidence, and it's this question about how do architects react to big data, which is only going to be an ongoing sort of condition, and how do you parse it? And so this is an example of us beginning to grapple with that. And finally, I just want to circle back. I'm 5 minutes away here to questions. We good? Excellent. So the Granary project, which kind of imploded at one point, was kind of interesting. No, I mean, it didn't literally implode. I mean, the wood frame grain version of it actually imploded, but the politics of the project fell apart for us. But what was interesting is on the back end of that, the Pew Center for Arts and Culture, who's been a friend in a number of ways to us, said, you know, Philadelphia just is not thinking big about history. We want to really ramp up the discussion around historic preservation, and gave us a little bit of room to kind of invent. They actually funded 3 different cycles of this project we called Gray Area, which was really about historic preservation tends to be either you keep it or you don't. And it goes back to some of these projects I was showing. How can we begin to tinker and tool around with that? So I think some of the things we argued was this idea that, you know, traditional preservation tends to be very focused to the left of this, which is about buildings and details, and like the first slip form concrete building, we can't touch it, that's important as a kind of memory, but really beginning to think about neighborhoods and cities and how they're affected by both positive and negative qualities of old construction. Our first cycle was, and really this was the challenge of like, how do you begin to calibrate preservation to the local conditions of your city, which I'm curious about what the conversations are like here. They must be fascinating. But the first iteration was just figuring out if people cared and asking big questions. The second iteration was a dinner we had for 100 people, which I'll just show a couple pictures of, and had some conversations. And then the third one was really going to the neighborhood level. And the first iteration was a book we put together, invited a bunch of our friends that we thought were doing interesting things in Philadelphia. And the first thing was to say, actually, there are interesting responses to history happening, that it's not to say that there aren't. And we talked about shells and platforms and voids. So, you know, shells are going in and changing the inside. Platforms are the Granary and the Eastern Building, which I talked about, which are literally like sort of plinths or objects upon which you can build. And then voids, much like Detroit, Philadelphia, there's a lot of vacancy and underutilized area, and we wanted to include that as part of the kind of history making and organized around that. We had this wonderful conversation, this symposium where we were very proud of the fact that the audience was largely without gray hair, although I do see a couple of people with gray hair in there, and not to say that that's bad, but the whole thing was like, here's a bunch of young people coming out to talk about historic preservation. I think that was really a great thing. The second iteration was the dinner for 100, and I apologize, clearly we'd all been drinking because this photograph is of embarrassing quality. This really was about getting neighbors and community leaders and city officials and architects and designers into the same room to talk about these issues. This is what the invitation looked like. We commissioned a short film where we interviewed people in different neighborhoods of Philadelphia talking about history, and it was super fascinating to hear people in certain neighborhoods kind of romanticizing old history and thinking about neighborhoods that the people living there are kind of crumbling, but to other people seem charming. People out in neighborhoods talking about, you know, how difficult it can be to live among these buildings. And it was a really interesting opening up of the bandwidth of that conversation. And then the third iteration, which we found most interesting as a design process, and I'm happy to report is going to be included in a Cooper Hewitt exhibition in the fall, is this card deck, which really was about getting people to have this conversation on their own in an inclusive way. And I can't say too much about this because I don't have all the images here, but I do, basically it was a kind of self-guided conversation deck where the card started with, where were you born? How do you feel about change? Very broad questions that got people talking, and then eventually presented facts about a building and then allowed people to go on record with values and design ideas. And what was fascinating is that there was no real conclusion. There was no product outside of the fact that students, 40-year neighborhood residents, professionals and non-professionals sat at a table and talked in a way that we found, what we realized is if we were leading the conversation, it would be a very different vibe than the card deck allowing people to talk through some of these issues. And so this is a real budding interest of ours in thinking about sort of methods and mechanisms for kind of conducting this idea that we think of as influence through the conversation space. And then lastly, this is an exhibition that we mounted this past year in Philly, and it was kind of interesting. And we kind of called it like walking into an Illustrator file, which is exactly how it felt when you walked into the room. And this was basically a kind of catalog of row house typologies based on projects that we had designed. But I think you can kind of see some of that periodic table of micro units in this diagram, where you can see the stair types on the left, switchback, rotated, linear, stacked, and you see the width dimensions on the bottom. And those little speech bubbles talk about the kinds of opportunities that are hashed at those different dimensional gateways. And was really a kind of, and it was funny because people that came into the exhibition were very interested in just thinking about their own houses and thinking about becoming aware of the dimensional constraints through this diagram. And then we also constructed this little, what we call the playhouse, which allowed people to take stairs. You see the pink stairs, those are the 4 different stair types and different floor plates and different programs, and to kind of investigate and play with the sort of space of the house. And we're at the moment in the running for a very interesting grant that would allow us to do a much more expansive row house study in Philadelphia. So this, and there's a number of other things we're doing that we see as a kind of feedback loop for the practice, that we're making buildings, and we take building buildings very seriously, but also take the spin-off opportunities like the gray area project and the row house research, and some other things we're doing to help reinform how we're doing that. That's it. Thank you.
Few questions, because we were going to be here till 8. Brian, you ended up very quickly. Appreciate that. But questions about the work or about the approach or about Brian's teaching. He didn't talk about that, but I'm sure that that's probably fair game for the questions as well.
Do you guys do models when coming up with some of the windows and the incisions and the way you guys pull it out? Do you like practice models? Did you need?
Do we build models?
Yeah, like physical models.
Yeah, I mean, we do, although I have to say that it's waned a bit. We're finding ourselves using 3-dimensional software in fast, iterative ways that we think are similar to building models, but we also see we go back and forth. It depends on the project. But 3-dimensional visualization is super important to us, and I think, but I will say that the windowing, and there was a particular project, a very early project, where we learned something about the sort of strategy to thinking about facades, where we would make these diagrams and maps of possible places where windows could happen, and to kind of extract through a series of diagrams to figure out where they go. So becoming less compositional and more sort of performative.
Other question? I have a quick one for you.
Yeah.
It seems that real estate valuation, as well as the kind of very mathematically defined measures of sustainability, all of these things factor into the design. I wonder if you could share how you allow that to enter into the process. At what point does it enter into the process? How does that find its way into the project, I guess, physically, right,
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that we take some liberties now, because particularly on things like urban housing and energy performance, we've learned a lot. So our first moves are now completely contaminated by the knowledge of like what we shouldn't do at all. But early on, and it continues to be a trend in areas where we're less familiar, it happens immediately. Consultants, data, research, performance. I mean, the one thing that we've realized, if you're trying to be realistic about the budget and the time frame in which a project gets realized, you need to consider that stuff if you want it to really happen. And the other thing we've realized is that it leads to credibility, that if you can solve those things, many of those things aren't that hard to solve, and you don't want your design to get in the way of their solution. So you start with those, you gain credibility, and then you actually get some bandwidth to play after you fold that into the project.
Thank you.
What was more cost effective, using SIPs or the
Double stud. But I'll say that it didn't necessarily have to do with what you would, I think the analysis might lead you otherwise. The reason why the double stud proved to be affordable was every subcontractor in Philadelphia could bid it. And so you're just getting much more competition. I think that, yeah. But I mean, we've used SIPs and we believe in them, and they're obviously just incredible from an insulation standpoint if you keep your foundation wall plumb, as I was saying. But yeah, the double stud is at the moment winning out.
I have a question.
Give up on the microphone. Is that all right? E-learning people? All right, that's fine.
I have a question about kind of business culture in general. I came from a startup that I was running out in LA before coming back here to grad school. And we always struggled with balancing the work with kind of research and teaching and all of these other things. We wanted to find time to do never could. Can you talk a little bit about how you built that culture and how you guys do that? Is it through a lot of grants? Do you find sponsors for these events like the ones you showed in Funkin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first thing I'll say is that, we don't have to figure it out. I mean, this is a really, really difficult business. It's a difficult business if you're just trying to make money. It's a difficult business if you're just trying to keep buildings from leaking. It's a profoundly difficult business if you're trying to mix research and, practice. I mean, I will say that, I think that everybody on the team believes in the mission, and I think we all work hard. We all, take credit for everything. It's one of the really key, if you're interested in culture, I think this is something that we're really proud of, and is the fact that, not everybody can do everything. I mean, you know this from startup, right? Like when you're small and nimble, you have to exploit different people's skills. But I think, when there's somebody over in Revit for 3 months and seeing other people doing research or doing something that's a little bit more speculative, I think we're of a scale, we're 10 people, where everybody knows that they're part of the team that's generating this body of work, and I think that there's mutual respect between figuring out how to build a building and figuring out how to have an idea. That may be my best answer, because honestly, and we're quite worried, we have some big things teed up, and we're worried about growth could inhibit that, and you start becoming factioned with these people do this and these people do that. So I think it's this being on the same page with that really makes it go. I'll also say, I think that I have a lot of students that work in the office. A lot of my staff go into studio and do workshops on visualization and software, reviews. So there's a tight. That's actually easy stuff. I mean, and I think everybody loves it. That there's a conversation between school and work in a very authentic way. I mean, most of my time is work, but I think I think sometimes people at work feel like they're in school and students feel like they're working, and I think that's maybe a sign of success on that front.
Do you have any intention of expanding the business or organization towards the West Coast or on West Coast?
We've talked to a lot of people. In fact, I'm talking to a guy next week in Philly that wants to do a hotel in Portland. I mean, I think we've gotten to a point where Philadelphia can't support, any one city can't support all the ambitions of a practice, and then the question is where are the projects? And it's tough because remote practice is a little, I'm learning, is a little different than home-based practice, especially when you're building with the guy in the pickup truck. How do you translate that to other cities, right? And part of that's the right partners. And so I think, my answer to that is I think we're geography agnostic, see the hurdles, but for the right project, I think we're always game. But we're not specifically going. So right now, what actually we're doing, it's one of the reasons why we're interested in this city to some degree, is we're now looking at the neighborhoods we work in Chicago and Philly and Boston, which are all these kind of just out of the core. It's kind of like if there's vacant land, great coffee, and a bunch of rock bands practicing, it's probably a neighborhood where our work will play well. And what we realize is every city now has this neighborhood in this place. And so one of the things we're doing is we're looking at those different kinds of places, and because I think there's a lot of common ground with people that are working in those areas, and that happens in all cities. But thinking less about the geography and more about the kind of place in different cities where that work can be supported. Great, thanks.